I walk to the stage. Excuse me. You're all very welcome. This has been live streamed and to about 200 people right now. So I'm going to welcome everybody on the virtual platform as well, Facebook and YouTube. So it's brilliant that we have an audience here, though, in the physical as well. So that's great. So you're all more than welcome. And I'm not going to say very much. I just want to introduce our moderator, but I want to first of all, I have a few people that I need to thank, and they are the people who enable Open House happen, and it's the IF team, Karen, and all of the team who make Open House what it is, and I know they're super busy right now, and we had a great day today, and we'll have another fantastic day tomorrow. We haven't quite broken the back of it yet because tomorrow is also really, really busy. So for us, it's wonderful to be able to get out of the whole Zoom situation that we were in last year with Open House, and we're so looking forward to them next year again. And we've had some fantastic tours today, like really brilliant, and it's great to have this debate here, because people really need to gather in a city, and cities need people and people need cities, and and that's really what tonight's event is about, living for the city and proclaiming our our belief and our necessity for the city. So I want to introduce our moderator, Linda Doyle, here beside me, who is just wonderful, and the Provost of President of Trinity College Dublin, the first woman to ever have that role in its 429-year history. So we're delighted that you're here, Linda, and she will moderate this session. And I want to thank our sponsors as well, Dublin City Council and Dunleary Rathdown, the Arts Council, and the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and BAM as well, and also our 25 corporate partners. So I think I'll just hand over to you and take it from there. So thanks a million.
Thank you, Natalie. Without a doubt, Open House weekend is one of the best weekends in Dublin, so I am delighted to be here. It's absolutely brilliant to see real people. I know the people online aren't seeing the real people here, but it's fantastic, and to be here with friends on stage. We have an amazing group of people, and I'm just going to start by introducing them. I have always found by coming to these events I learn a huge amount myself, and I absolutely expect that tonight. So I'll start by introducing Bob Jordan. So Bob has just been appointed since September the CEO of the Housing Agency. Before joining the Housing Agency, he was National Director of the Housing First programme. He was also Special Advisor in 2016 and 2017 to the former Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government. Prior to that, he was Chief Executive of the national housing charity Threshold. I'm proud to say he's a graduate of Trinity, even though we were talking earlier about him not having used his computer science and software engineering degree. And he holds a Master's in International Relations. I think one of the words to best describe him is that he's passionate about what he does, passionate about housing, about homelessness, and I think that passion is something you're going to see in general on this panel this evening. Next to Bob is Andrea Horan. I found a great sentence on the TEDx site describing you as entrepreneur, a communicator, a glitter activist, and sometimes drag queen, all of which I thought was a fantastic description. Andrea has a fantastically interesting background. She worked in the youth marketing agency Think House. She owns the nail bar Tropical Popical, And she uses that as a platform for many things, for collaborations in art with the RHA, the National Gallery of Ireland. So I think it's just so interesting the way you do that. I also found this other really interesting sentence, that she celebrates her beliefs in the 3 Fs: feminism, femininity and fun. And I think you couldn't have a better description. And she's always, active in really key political issues such as repeal. But at the moment, she leads No More Hotels, and there's a fantastic 20-minute documentary online on that if anyone wants to look at it. And she's also running the United Ireland podcast. So a lot of fantastic knowledge to bring to us this evening, and I'm delighted you're here. Then we move on to Andrew Griffin. So Andrew Griffin is an architect, an urbanist. He studied in the Royal Academy in Copenhagen and graduated from the Dublin School of Architecture. I was totally stunned by all that he has done. He's worked with really interesting architects such as Rem Koolhaus, Bjarke Ingels and Julian de Smet in Copenhagen. So luckily for us, after his 7 years in Copenhagen, in which he did amazing work and went all over the world with that, he's come back to Dublin and has co-founded Urban Agency. So Urban Agency, which I think is really, really important to what we're doing here tonight, is an architecture and urbanism office working around the world and tries to think big but care about the small details. And I have to say, I just loved that sentence in that kind of level of ambition, but that care for what you do. And I could go on talking about Andrew. He has so much on his CV, but I think that gives you a real flavour of what he's bringing to the platform. And then finally, our mysterious figure, if you want to call him that at the end, is from Subset. And I think the best way to describe our guest from Subset is by quoting their website. So if you look at their website, it says, "What is Subset? Who is Subset?" And it says, "The former is continuously developing, and the latter has been in a state of flux since inception. To us, neither are relevant." So I think that's the best way to introduce the representative from Subset. And you're very, very welcome. And I really, really look forward to what you have to say as well. So with that, I think we will get to the meat of the evening. And the title today is called Living for the City. And I've actually been asking quite a few people over the last few weeks, what do they think living for the city means? And in fact, actually, some people respond to that as being a very upbeat statement, and some people read it as living in subservience to the city. So I think just to get started, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to give us kind of maybe a 2-minute feel for what they think living for the city means. And we're going to start with Bob and then move through the panel and go on to a few questions for me. And then I'd be really, really keen that, I know some of the people in the audience, and I bet you're going to have loads of questions. So Bob, would you like to start?
Thanks, Linda. This is my first live event in 18 months, so it's a real privilege to be here in front of an audience. What it means to me is, I'm somebody who loves Dublin. I live 5 minutes away from here on Lower Ormond Quay, and I've lived there for almost 30 years. Prior to that, I lived on Dame Street. So what I think the city means to me, I'm a fan of the life-size city, the 15-minute city, the idea that a city is where you can get together and make things happen. So for me, like my entire career is the map of the Dublin city centre. I've worked in the Custom House, I've worked in Leinster House, I've worked in Dublin City Council, I've worked in threshold offices in Stoney Batter, I've worked in Dublin Simon Community in Cope Street in Temple Bar, and I've worked in the Union of Students in Ireland in Bedford Row, all within walking distance. And now I'm on Upper Mount Street, a slightly longer walk of maybe 20 minutes. I don't drive, I don't want to drive. But it gives me great autonomy and agency to be able to have an entire housing career that's based in Dublin city centre. Obviously what I want is for other people to be able to enjoy that as well. When I moved into Dublin city centre in the early 90s, there are pictures by a guy called David Jazet of Dublin before the Tiger. Mm-hmm. And basically Lower Ormond Quay looks like a bomb site. And when I moved into the city first, you couldn't buy a loaf of bread after 6 p.m. in the evening. You'd have to go to that petrol station on Usher's Quay to buy a pack of fags. So the city was dead. So the first thing to say is Dublin's come a long way. And partly a couple of thousand people like me moved into the city in the mid-90s. But obviously there's a lot more to do. I think one of the things that has really offended people, I would say, during COVID, especially when we had our 2-kilometre perimeter and 5-kilometre perimeter, and you're really looking at the area around you, is the number of vacant buildings. And actually, I think for me, the most poignant thing for me is really younger people saying, I could live there, the building is empty. So one of the things, like, for me as CEO of the housing agency, that's really important is to bring vacant buildings into productive use. We have bought about 500 vacant properties over the last number of years. Now, these are perfectly fit vacant properties, but a lot of those properties have gone actually to people who are homeless. But equally, there are derelict buildings around that require a lot more attention. So one of the things that we'll be doing over the current period of the new housing strategy is advising local authorities on compulsory purchase orders, which are actually, in a way, forcing properties back into use. And I suppose the other thing is I'm very much in favour of compact urban growth. So this idea that, most new buildings, or at least a very high proportion of new buildings, up to 50%, should be in the footprint of the existing city, on brownfield sites, infield sites, and so on, because urban sprawl pushes people further away, but also urban sprawl kills cities. So, I'm very hopeful about the future, but there's a long way to go on a lot of these issues. Thanks, Linda.
Okay, that's a good start. Gives us a sense of where you're coming from. Andrea, what does living for the city mean to you?
I think living for the city resonates with me because I actually do, but I think more poignantly would be living because of the city. I think the city has been so intrinsic in making me the person I am and my development. And I'm from Tala, and I travelled into the city centre from the time I was 15 to work. And every experience from then on till now has shaped my outlook on life, how I interact with people, my journey, and my career. And I think without that impact of the city, I come to the city from a more emotional kind of way and a more philosophical way. I suppose whenever I think of what does the city mean, I bring it back to, like, what is the point of life? A nice little light subject. And when I break down what is the point of life, the point of life is obviously to have somewhere to live that's safe and warm. But it's also, I think, very important to focus on the pleasure of life and what we enjoy doing and what being alive means. And for a lot of the narrative and conversations around city growth and being alive is all about the grind and all about how we make the city work, how we make it pay back essentially economically. But there's almost like this element of shame about admitting that we are happy to focus on a city that provides for our souls, that it provides entertainment, it provides amenities, it provides the ability to not have to shop to be part of the city, that there is an element of people living in the city and that are going about their day-to-day life that is not just working and buying. And I think what COVID opened up for me specifically was when I live in Dublin 8, so I'm very close. I was able to go into town. There was no life in the south side of the city, and the difference between the north side, where you have people living within the city and over retail, etc., is very different to the south side, where there isn't that kind of vibe in the city. So it's how do we get the balance right between living, buying, being, that isn't just driven by economic reasons, that is actually that we can shake the shackles of shame around pleasure and the joy of being in the city.
Thank you. That's it. And Andrew, how about you? What does living for the city mean to you?
So, I think this should just be a debate about the city. So when I was studying architecture here, there was, we never really talked about it, which is kind of surprising. We're meant to be the people talking about it. We were just designing little buildings wherever they were, but not really thinking about, how that sat into a sort of wider picture. And then I sort of ended up in Rotterdam, and it was amazing being there because the Dutch, they're so used to moulding their country, be it dikes or huge water projects or reclaiming land, that they just think about it in a different way, then I ended up in Copenhagen, where there was just a really active debate among everyone on a Saturday morning reading their Sunday paper about like what their city should be, and having an elected mayor and helped kind of shape that like debate, because it was sort of every 4 years somebody was saying what they think the city should be and what you'd have to vote for it. So I just think that there needs to be a little bit more open debate here, not among maybe the people whose job it is to deal with the city, they're all doing it anyway, but just among the average person about what they want their city to be, and that'll eventually filter through to the city and shaping it. So yeah.
So it's kind of a principle of debate that you're
just thinking about it more, principle debate, and like having it as an open conversation. I think that's that's really important.
And how about you? What does living for the city mean to you?
Well, I think the city is its people and a sense of civic duty to ensure that no man, woman or child suffer needlessly, and to ensure that the basics and the bare minimum are taken care of for everyone that inhabits this city, this island, this nation. And I would say at the moment that isn't the case. And in our opinion at least, that should be the priority, number one. And then when that is taken care of, then I think you look to see how the city develops from multiple other perspectives, but a unified front which considers the well-being and the welfare of our population, city, nationwide, is probably the utmost importance to us.
And maybe just to pick up on a few points. Bob, you were talking there about the kind of compact living, and I was just wondering, could you just tell us kind of some more about that? Because I often think as well, why can't people occupy spaces in the city more? Why can't we use vacant property? And yet, I think there's probably everyone in this room and everyone that I've met for the last decades have been asking that question. And to me, anyway, I'm glad to hear that we have that you are in control of some of those vacant properties, but for me definitely it doesn't look like anything is changing, that it's still a huge barrier to see that.
Yeah, well, I think the answer, Linda, is a lot more needs to be done. We're not just talking about Dublin here. I mean, like for instance, places like Tralee would have 20 to 25% of commercial and residential properties empty. You can imagine what it feels like.
Yeah.
And there's lots of towns and cities or towns and villages like that around Ireland. So one of the things that I suppose is being worked on is what's called the Town Centre First strategy, which is really about getting public services, getting people back living in cities again, because it does create a sort of particularly even during COVID, that there is a sort of an alienating landscape that develops because if you see ground floor commercial properties abandoned for long periods of time. If you see residential properties boarded up, and everybody in the city has the right to ask the question, like, why isn't that property being put in?
And what are the key barriers? Like, what is still stopping us doing that? It seems to me, that it's just such an open goal. Like, what's stopping us?
Well, part of it is just some people haven't put them back into productive use. I mean, I suppose it's a communications piece as well. It's going there are very good examples. Like, for instance, in Cork, I was down recently. There's a bank that's been empty for a long time there. And the Peter McVerry Trust have opened it up as their regional office, but they also converted it into 5 one-bed apartments, of which at least 2 homeless people will occupy. But it is about, putting in the hard yards in terms of finding out who the owner of that building is, talking to them about why it isn't in use, and then offering them some options. So it really is about pounding the pavements, and we need, vacant homes officers everywhere around the country. There are some in local authorities, but they need to be full-time.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I jump in on that? I think ideologically things have to change as well, because even if we look at the budget and where the vacant property tax went from 7% and then was repackaged but down to 3%, we have a big problem with land speculation. We're looking at sites that are like the cultural centre on the Quays, that was the land speculation brought up to 40 million. So there's no reason for people to sell their land or to underelict it per se, because they're making money from it just sitting there and the speculation. So until it comes from a top down, the bottom up perspective won't be able to kick in.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of examples of, as you just said, absolutely doing nothing and you're still accruing wealth because of it. Speaking of that, I loved the sentence you wrote about not having to, which you said earlier, not having to shop to be part of the city, and I think that's just so important, that the city isn't just this machine for you to, for increased consumerism. Could you tell us a little bit about maybe no more hotels and how the kind of the culture piece is coming in there, so you don't have to just shop or stay in a hotel to be in this city?
On the not having to shop, I think specifically South William Street, where our shop is, the centre of the university. When that all kicked off in COVID, people were coming into it, but there was what happened with the partying and all that jazz was problematic, and there was the call out for bins, and there was the pushback of like, if we provide bins, people will use them, and then seats have been taken away off the street, benches so there's nowhere to sit. There was councillors calling for toilets to be put in. And then the comment that came back after all of that was, actually, don't worry, it was the Taoiseach said, don't worry, businesses are going to be opening back up soon, so there'll be toilets and facilities around. So the role of who's providing the amenities for our city has been transferred into businesses. So if you want to avail of the city a lot of the time, if you're not spending money, then that's problematic. Then for No More Hotels, we set that up as a club night because we wanted to party, but also because we were looking at how the eradication of places to dance was happening, and it was being replaced by hotels, student accommodation, co-living, and there was there is the conversation that we need these things to happen to keep the city moving, and there's I think there was 20 hotels built in the last 2 years, and there's another 20 in the next 2 years. So that's all well and good. Tourism or Fáilte Ireland are saying we need all these beds. Brilliant, we probably do. We have to catch up with other cities, but there's no one replacing the spaces that have been taken for cultural means. And if we look at who is responsible for providing the cultural aspects of a city, we're being completely ignored. So then we set up No More Hotels, and it was for a clubbing community. It was where I'm interested in what I like to do. But what's happening now is, we've seen in the last couple of weeks with the cobblestone and Merchants Art, that the interest in that is moving, because it's moving into more mainstream, maybe cultural interests of things that are so ingrained in our psyche and in our heritage, and now they're being looked at to be eradicated, so it's affecting a lot more people. So where you're going from something that was a lot more niche with clubbing, and we were shouting about it, and so many other people have been shouting about it for ages, but it was well, it doesn't really affect us. Most people who have positions of power don't really go clubbing, not to generalise, I'm 41, I still like it. But now that it's coming into a more mainstream thing that's affecting more cultural things that are relevant to more people, I think you can only see the protests that have happened the last week. There's sessions outside the Dáil, and so many groups have popped up over the last week, like Reclaim the City, Dublin is Dying. So there's this real energy coming around that people are saying no more. So I think
it's interesting that you say that as well, because I don't know, I see some faces here who were at the last time, excuse me, I was at the big debate. I think it was obviously before COVID, but we had a lot of chat that time, especially with people interested in the cultural life of the city and how that was being eroded, and whether it was kind of spaces for artists, and to a certain extent the conversation, I'm glad to see that there's activism, but we're still stuck in that spot where we're still fighting that. And I suppose, maybe Andrew, to pick up from you were talking about, and you mentioned the notion of an elected mayor, and we often throw that around, and again we had actually back at the big debate in 2019, we were speaking about elected mayors as well, and it strikes me as we think that might solve things far too easily, and that unless that comes with power and resources, that might not make a difference. Do you want to maybe unpack your interest in the elected mayor and what you spoke about for Copenhagen?
Yeah, I think I think there's a couple of things about, Denmark's the same size as Dublin. Copenhagen's the same size as Dublin. Denmark's the same size as Ireland. The cities are very similar, but they've kind of just done it very well. And I think what's different about there is they just think really, really long term. So there's obviously lots of stuff we can solve in the short term. We need to get on, but they're thinking 30, 40, 50, 60 years ahead. Their finger plan, which is how the whole of Copenhagen is planned, was voted in the 40s. So, and it's still the plan for the city. 80 years later, and they just think about things in a very long horizon. And they have, I suppose, as a nation, they're also just quite self-confident. In many ways, Ireland's a new country, and we maybe don't always have the self-confidence to do massive projects. If you think of Dublin, even if you think of the Liffey was constructed. It's an enormous infrastructural project. And somebody did it. And if you think of putting in the railway line across the coast, or the waterworks, that was all done, but a lot of it 100 years ago or more. I think sometimes we've taken a few missteps here, and it gives you a little knock on or chip that you maybe can't pull off the big stuff. And I think what was great about Copenhagen is they try things, and if they get it wrong, they just go, well, we're going to learn from it. And if they get it right, they tell everyone about it. And I think Here, there's just, when you're trying to do a big project, whether it's a big cultural thing or, there's just a lot of kickback from the average person in the media, and I think it's very hard to pull off big projects in that environment. So I think it's also down to the average everyday person to sort of support those kind of things, because otherwise they just won't happen, and I think that's the big difference I see here to Denmark maybe. There's both like a thinking long term, but there's also the citizens are just engaged to say, well, let's just try it, let's see what happens.
And you just brought out something there that triggered something. So when I was reading about you, one of the things that you said is that you love to think for the longer term and imagine the city in 2040 or 2070. And you just mentioned there that Copenhagen got it right in the 40s and were able to think long term. How do you even do that? I mean, I would be hard pushed to say, well, what Dublin should look like in 2070. Like, what are the tools for doing that?
In some ways you can't. Like, that's the point. You can't just think about everything. Like,
so how do you, when you say, I want to think about Dublin in 2070?
Okay, so I think you have to think about it over time. So in 1840, the world reached 1 billion people. So it took all of humanity to reach 1 billion. And we were building out Georgian squares. So there was fields, and then there was these huge buildings, being constructed in a very planned way. And then by sort of 1960s, we reached 3 billion, around the world. And in Dublin, we were starting to build suburbia. We were sort of going outside the city, low-rise, sprawl, car-based society, and so on. And then we reached 7 billion in 2013, and we were starting to fill in our docks and do all the sort of things that are about that are really the right thing to do. The question is now, like, what's Ireland going to look like in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? And what it looks like is that we're going to grow at a rate we've never grown like before, and then it's going to plateau. So, in a way, the decisions we make now, are the ones that we're going to be stuck with. So whether we build big culture centres, or we build a metro, or we build an orbital network, or we build more swimming pools, or whatever it is, that, as we grow, that'll be left for generations. So I think we need to kind of think it through. I don't think anyone has the answer. If you ask a lot of people here, will Dublin be a tech capital in 1981? What was tech? What was Google? How could you plan the Docklands then? So I don't think we can forward plan everything, but I think we have to try and think what are fixes and what are flexible.
That's interesting, because I often feel actually there's a lot of fixes about the city that we now cannot get out of, that are kind of determining how we're stuck now. So I think it's an interesting way of thinking. Maybe moving back to Subset, you spoke about some very fundamental kind of needs of people, and how does what Subset do in your art kind of relate to that, and how do you think those things are connected?
Just this evening. Was it on?
Maybe just shout if you can.
I think what Andrew said is totally correct. Like, we definitely need to be thinking about the future of our city now, but for the majority of people it's very difficult to think 10, 20 years into the future when they can barely think past today or next week, because...
Okay, thanks.
Is that okay?
It doesn't sound like it's on, but it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I think Andrew is totally correct, and to have that ability to consider how we're shaping our future and to engage as many people as possible in that's incredibly important. But to refer back to what I was saying earlier, I think the majority... Whoa, only one up here with a mic. Sorry. I think the majority of people are so squeezed that it's very difficult to let their imagination take shape. And if there's no imagination, there's not exactly a lot of, just at a very basic level, fun, and that can kind of squeeze the life out of a city and constantly make what happens in it matters of contention, and that's when people sort of turn on one another and have that kind of begrudging mentality that the Irish are famous for. But in relation to what we do, to be honest, feel sort of out of place on stage with the other three people that are here. But I suppose in our own little microcosm, what we try and do is take subject matter that we feel is socially important and communicate that through art and culture in a hope to predominantly entice and engage the youth in the subject matter that the artwork is often inspired by, in the hope that we can ensure people kind of maintain that inner child, that sense of imagination, that sense of excitement, and hopefully then think further into the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, our outlook at the moment is quite bleak, so I'm sorry if I sound quite negative on stage, but you know, what we see every day on the streets when we're actually out and engaging with different communities between addiction, homelessness, housing, for the majority of people, they just seem so squeezed, and that kind of leads to a very bleak opinion of your city that you're inhabiting, and where that's going to go, and most importantly, your part in that city. I think a lot of people feel like they're, you know, just a 9 to 5 to make ends meet, and, you know, repeat again and again. And I think, you know, that completely diminishes that sense of civic duty, because if you have to just consider yourself, your children, your family, your dependents, and you can't think out past that, or you can't, you know, widen that sense of purpose, things become very insular. And when that happens, there's actually a lack of community, because people have to just focus on them, can barely focus on their neighbour, never mind then other members of their city. So
I think it's very important you do represent that bleakness, because I think that is out there for a lot of people, and I also think what you say about the imagination is just so important. If you can't have that, you can't then, you know, think beyond and think for that longer term. I'd like to open it up for people to have questions. Because it's live streaming, we do need people to speak into the microphone if they're asking questions, and I think we have some. Oh yes, I see somebody. I see somebody with the microphone. So I think Lisa, have you your hand up? Or there's a question over here.
Thanks, and thanks to all the speakers. It's not a very complicated question. It's just what seems to be happening at the moment is people feel a deep sense of alienation from who's making the decisions about the city. And so in Copenhagen in the 1940s, maybe it was quite clear that the planners and the local authority were making plans. But I think what has people really confused at the moment and maybe alienated is the fact that it seems to be happening, you know, it's kind of global capital is really kind of making these decisions. So, you know, people might feel at an individual level that they're lacking a sense of agency, but they're also not sure where that agency is lying. So with, say, on board Planola decisions, sometimes, you know, overturning even their own inspectorate or advisors, as has happened, or as seems to have happened with Merchants Arch. And I wonder if the panel can talk a little bit about that, about what they feel their sense of agency is, and then kind of the more broader sense of agency at a local, national, or even international level in terms of how Dublin is actually being shaped. Because I think the alienation and confusion is partly, you know, I teach at third level. Most of the students I teach can't afford to pay rent in all the student housing that's happening. So it's just, there seems to be an absolute kind of dysfunction with what's actually being built and what's actually needed, even at that level. Thanks.
That's a great question, Lisa, and I think we can even ask ourselves, like, are even our own government making the decisions that they're just caught up in this kind of wider, I think, commercial drivers internationally. Any comments that people want to make? Anyone just...
I think personally, I think there's a disconnect between how our democratic system is set up, and I think we need to look at it, at actually having a democratically elected local authority, that because there's this illusion that the councillors are doing so much, whereas councillors are a lot of the time very powerless, whereas the executive are making the decisions. And then when you have the decisions being made by unanswerable people who you don't feel like you're feeding into, and that is driven by like a glib approach to financial drivers rather than actually providing the amenities and the fabric of the city that we need to make it a society rather than an economy. and when you can't actually, like there doesn't seem to be a blueprint or a plan or a future for the city. That we have the development plans, but they're never adhered to, and everything in the development plan is disregarded. Then you have on board Panelists decisions being disregarded. Then you have the councillors putting forward calls for toilets that are being disregarded, and it's like, well, it feels very small, the decision making, and how this amount of power has fallen into a very small group of people who are deciding on what the fabric of our city is going to be in the future. When we don't have anything that has a map of how it's going to develop, it feels very reactive, and it feels very not encompassing anything more than an economic position.
Bob, can you give us any hope at the housing agency?
Well, I suppose what I could say, just from a personal point of view, is obviously I'm somebody who has worked in the NGO sector, worked for Dublin Simon community, worked for Threshold. You know, people very much at risk of losing their tenancies in the private rented sector, people sleeping on the streets, and then obviously I've gone into the system, if you like. But there are levers in there. Yeah. Like, I mean, I suppose what I'm really saying is, it's all about values. So the values are very simply: do the right thing, do everything you can to increase more supply, and leave no one behind. And there are people, obviously, in public service who, like me, who are doing, working on that. But I suppose we had an economic recession where we stopped building. It wasn't counter-cyclical. We didn't build more houses maybe when we should have. We keep public services going when we should have, and we're still coming out of that. And unfortunately, it takes a long time. To get the system moving again. But things are moving, But the most important thing is that everybody, that people are so passionate about housing and homelessness in Ireland that, and people have on this panel, and indeed out there, because I know some of the people out there, have found different ways of making that voice heard. We just need to keep keep pushing.
I think keep pushing really a lot.
Can I say that why are we set up in a system where you have to push and campaign and protest to get the basic needs of a city? And I always go back to the sentence of each and every one of us owns this city as much as anyone else. Nobody owns this city anymore. So why do we not have a system that allows, and our plan, you have to kind of, I suppose, go against planning rather than have an input into planning. So why do we not have an equal voice as part of a democratic society?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that to get things to happen, it shouldn't always be that it's about protests, and that the voice needs to be there earlier. Do you want to get in there?
In the bureaucracy and red tape and middlemen is just absolutely astonishing in the majority of areas that we've been engaged with, which has been quite a substantial amount. And I think no one is really willing to put their head on the chopping block for a decision. And there's no motivation or incentive to do so. And as long as the structure or system is operated in such a fashion, I think it will just continue to perpetuate the problems that we see. But again, that comes back to, at the end of the day, it's on us as the public to make demands of those who are in positions of authority. But it's very difficult for those of us in the general public to do that when it's difficult to make ends meet. So you're sort of caught between focusing on your own problems versus the problems of your city and your nation.
I think there's kind of a growing divide as well, where people are so busy focusing, as you said, on just surviving, versus people who maybe have a vested interest in it developing in a particular way, with a big gap in the middle increasingly.
It's also very important, I think, to try and form your own opinion on what is happening on a day-to-day basis, and ignore the rah-rah of the Green Jersey Brigade and everybody in this together. And we're such a passionate country for this, that and the other. I mean, don't get me wrong, the passion for homelessness and for housing is great, and it's incredible. And we've been engaged with so many individuals and groups who are incredibly passionate about it. Yeah, we're still in a completely disgraceful position. So, all that energy and all that time and money going into different areas in an attempt to resolve or progress them, ultimately kind of seems to come to naught, or very little progress is made, whilst then other areas that maybe are of benefit to the global financial puppet masters that ultimately make a lot of the decisions for our government. At the end of the day, it seems that ultimately the decision rests with them, and until a time where we come together as a community, a widespread community through the city and through the rest of the country, I don't really see that changing.
Okay, anybody? Oh, yes, we have a question here. Hi, Ali.
Hi, and thanks everybody, and really great discussion, and I'm particularly interested to hear the gentleman from Subset. I think he's making some very important points. But I suppose my question is, do you think, does the panel think that people in Dublin understand how Dublin works, who's responsible for what? So, for example, is Dublin City Council doing a good enough job of explaining what it does, who does what, the limits of its power, as well as the extent of its power, and therefore where all the other agencies fit in? I think I kind of know the answer to my question, but I'd be interested to know what the panel thinks, and then if they have any suggestions as to how Dublin City Council could communicate what it does better, so that people who live and work in the city know who to ask when they want something done.
Any comments on that? Andrew, maybe you... Oh, sorry. One, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Work away.
It's very difficult for, no disrespect to anyone engaged in Dublin City Council. We know lots of them, and lots of them are incredibly hard-working people who do incredible work for the city, but a lot of them seem, especially in a position of authority, you look no further than what's in the news this week. I don't even need to go into it, but a lot of them seem to be out of touch with regards to what their actual duty is. And again, going back to that sense of civic duty, if you work for Dublin City Council, it should be nearly like you're a guardian of the city, that the public can look to for assistance. And I think that goes back into the elected aspect of it. But I think it's very difficult for these different agencies and government bodies to communicate effectively when it seems as though they don't know what they're doing themselves in a lot of instances. And sometimes I don't believe that's any sort of malicious behavior, but being completely honest, the level of incompetency, and this is coming from an artist collective, and if it's obvious to us, it must be obvious to people who maybe are considered to be in a more professional occupation or more educated in the areas of city planning, architecture, engineering, environmental, and so on. But I think like a complete overhaul and rethink of how time is invested and who it is that's investing that time is necessary. Because at the end of the day, I think anyone who decides to take up a position or take up the mantle in Dublin City Council should be answerable to the public of Dublin City.
Andrew, is there anything we can learn from Copenhagen or other cities you've worked in that could help us with this?
There's no easy answer to this. That's the thing. No city's cracked it. Copenhagen has a housing crisis, Amsterdam has a housing crisis. They all have similar issues. So it's not like there's a silver bullet that we can just fire out of a gun. I think everyone is trying hard, but it's just nobody's cracking it. Anyone I've worked in Ireland or in Copenhagen or any city are really passionate about what they do and really try hard, and it's just not easy, and it's not, especially, we're in a democracy, so everyone gets a little bit of everything, like the budget, everyone got €1 here and €1 there, not one big whammy somewhere to solve something. So I think, that's why I try and think long term, because I think there is a lot of very hard things to fix in the short term, but a lot of it comes because maybe some of some of the policies we have are hard to get out of. I think if you that's why I sort of try and ask, what do you want your life to look like? So, for instance, my my colleagues in Copenhagen, in the Danish office, they don't pay for childcare. It's free. So that's a huge cost. That's like, for most parents, 2 kids, that's 2,000 euros a month. You know, that's massive in terms of your life, you know, your little things. So I'd ask, like, how do we get rid of childcare costs? Like, we're not going to solve it in the next budget or maybe the next government, but in like 10 years, 20 years, how do we just get rid of it? Because it's like a mortgage for people. So to your point, is like, it's all these things adding up financially just make life harder. So I think we should have a debate about what we want our lives to look like, what, you know, and then it's like, okay, how do we get there? That's a much harder thing. But, you know, the great thing at the moment is, like, money's pretty cheap. You know, you can go to Europe and you know, it's pretty cheap to borrow money. So we should be investing in like really big projects now before money gets really expensive again. So I think that's something we should be doing a bit more as a country, and knowing, and I think it is actually happening. Like, if you look, there's a lot of funds. I think there's 3 billion being spent around the country now, and about 50% of that is on public space that's been given out already in the like URDF and ORDF funds. But you know, like a lot of the work we do as well is going to smaller towns and, you know, mid-sized cities and asking people, like, what do they want to live like? And it's really interesting. We turn up as, like, you know, we're hired by local authorities to kind of go and talk to people, and it's amazing what they think our role might be, and like the myriad of problems they come to us with that have nothing to do with the job I have.
And what kind of things do they think your role should
Like
be?
everything from parking meters to, you know, I'm there to sort of design public spaces or whatever, you know, and it's just interesting listening to it, and it's because it's different in every place, and there's some issues that are like, you know, from precincts you can see are actually quite easy to fix, like, you know, like putting parking in really good places so you can make more public spaces, so like just sort of tidying up certain things in towns and villages. There's some places that really surprised and shocked me what people wanted, like when we were in Carlow sitting with a group of like old farmer men in their 60s, 70s and 80s, and their number one wish was to be able to cycle to the town, you know, and that I just didn't expect that, you know, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. Because if they want it, then they can just push to have that happen, and suddenly, like, you've got a city like Carlow where they're saying, okay, we want this to be like the one thing we're known for. It's like, you know, cycling infrastructure, sustainable travel, all that kind of stuff. So I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what do we want our city to look like for our kids, because it's not an easy job to get there, you know, it's you know, so yeah.
Anyone else? A question from here? Yeah, the microphone is just coming.
It's probably a daft question, but I know the panel have raised it about hotels, and there's been this chant in the last week, no more hotels. With climate change, I suppose you've said it's for tourists, but we're facing a climate crisis. I'm assuming that people will not be encouraged to travel in the future the way we have been doing. So why are we building so many hotels, and who are they for? I mean, so
I think there's a really interesting thing about the building of hotels. I think there's a lobby group, obviously Fáilte Ireland, who are focusing on tourism, and they're pushing through hotels. But what's actually happening, what's interesting in what's happening is that a lot of hotel rooms are being taken up by people who have nowhere to live, and a lot of tourists are taking Airbnb. So hotels aren't actually being used for what their function is, and I think we will see a lot more domestic tourism. And I always say, whenever we do anything for No More Hotels, I love hotels. Like, they're one of the great joys of the world. But the problem is that we've been faced with a monoculture of hotels. Like, there just seems to be nothing else but hotels and student accommodation that are being created for the people who don't live in the city. And there seems to be a lack of priority of making a city for the people who live here first and foremost, and then having tourism as an added bonus. And obviously we need both of them, and I'm never against one business model, one commercial journey, but I think there has to be a balance, and I think that the influx of hotels is quite shocking when so much else is being erased and eradicated. So yeah, I think we do need hotel rooms, and I think we need to have a reason for them that isn't being used to house because of the housing crisis, which is another problem that has to be dealt with first before that can be dealt with. So it's all a chain.
But I think, you know, the point you bring about climate change, I think there's a lot of things that we haven't actually dealt with yet, of the implications of it. So while we speak on one part of that, we have to accept people will travel differently. We prepare ourselves for the same old tourism, I would have to say. You know, I don't know whether you agree with that. Some of the things I was reading that you've written is, you know, some great things have happened because of COVID. But, you know, to me at the moment, and I don't know whether you agree or disagree, that some of those good things, now there's been a lot of bad and sad things as well, but some of those good things are being eroded as we kind of forget and want to race back into the way we were. Do you agree or disagree? You know, and you know, some of the homeless problem, for example, was temporarily solved.
No, I don't agree with that. I think that, you know, I think Ali's question was about the kind of constellation of agencies and do we know who's running what. I mean, we know that collaboration is the solution to complex problems. So one of the things that did happen during COVID is the Department of Housing, Department of Health, local authorities and HSE got together to protect people who are homeless by, you know, obviously giving people one-bedroom accommodation, wrapping health supports around them, you know, sort of I suppose, you know, it used to take 12 to 14 weeks to get opioid substitution therapy, then it went down to 3 days.
And do you think that will stick?
Yeah, I think it will stick because all of us who are passionate about it, and you know, not just me, you know, not just people working in the public service, but out there want these things to stick, but also because they work. Yeah. But there is you know, and the reason that people are, you know, maybe a little bit incensed about hotel rooms is because we do understand there is a shortage of, like, we have 4,500 single adults who are homeless. They need one-bedroom accommodation. Actually, you know, one beds are like hen's teeth. Yeah. And we have a changing demographic. Yeah. Most people on local authority waiting lists need this. So clearly, this is something we need to get to grips with. Yeah. We are in Ireland in love with the 3-bedroom semi-detached house, but that's actually not what we need to solve homelessness, to help people on local authority waiting lists, or indeed to deal with the fact that we're an ageing population as well. But I do think new collaborations have happened during COVID that aren't just going to go away.
Good to hear. Have we another question? We have a question, Haran. It's behind you.
All right. So, yeah, we're facing a couple of crises, I suppose. But let's pick on the three. So the housing crisis, the current COVID crisis, and the climate change. So all those three have different timescales. So if you were to react fast in the COVID, in particular in terms of Dublin or cities or infrastructure, essentially in the cities, you would see effects in a matter of weeks. In terms of housing, sure, it takes years, but you would see effects in terms of years. But for the climate change, we won't see the effects of the good things we do for decades because we're facing just such a huge inertial load. So what I'm asking here is, where are we infrastructurally in preparing for the climate breakdown? Where are we in terms of planning? Speaking of Dublin in 2070, this is probably flooded by then. And so what are we doing there? And is there anything to hope for?
Easy question first. This is where it's great to be the moderator and you point at people.
Like, climate change is critical. It's like we're already at the tipping point. We're probably too far. Like, how do we deal with it? I think if you look at something like transport, like Dublin has a terrible overall transport historically. I'm not saying who's dealing with it now, but we just never spent enough money on it. If you compare again somewhere like Copenhagen, the journey time, let's say from Tallaght to Dublin on the Lewis, is about 55 minutes. Roughly. The same overlay of Copenhagen is about 22. So that's every morning somebody has 30 minutes more with their kids. Every evening they have 30 minutes more to do a hobby or do whatever they want to do. And commuting isn't fun. It's stress. So I think like we need a much better public transport network that's completely integrated, because it also means, like, in terms of vitality for the city, if it takes you an hour to get into a gig in the evening and an hour to get back, you're just less likely to do it. So I think part of our problem is that we can't get away from a car-based culture because we just don't have enough infrastructure. And it's huge money we're talking about, and you can see the myriad of projects over the years that have never quite got there. And I think that's where we really need to sort of ask ourselves, like, what do we want the city to look like in terms of a public transport network? I think like the things that are being tabled are great, but we just need a lot more of them, and we need neighborhoods much more interconnected, and so I think that'll shift at least one thing, which is the car-based culture we have, and I think at the moment there's a lot of people just like there's just the change in Dubliners in terms of cycling has been amazing. Over the last 10 years, like there's so many more people cycling, and it's they've embraced it so much, and that's the great thing about like Irish people and Dubliners and people from all sorts of city right now. People just can change pretty rapidly. Like the cities, like if you even think about the smoking ban, bringing everyone outdoors, or COVID, meaning that people realise that actually, 9 months a year you can actually be outdoors in Ireland, and it's brilliant. The thought of having a glass of wine in a park 2 years ago, you'd be like absolutely taboo, no way. And then throughout COVID, it's like people sitting there with their little, like bottles of wine and deck chairs, and it wasn't a problem. It wasn't like, I mean, sure there was incidents, but on the majority there wasn't an issue. So I think, we kind of need to embrace some of the change that's happened, but we need to sort of, like in terms of like transport and climate change, I think that it's a big issue here.
Your question actually here reminds me of Stuart Brand's kind of pace layering, where you actually look at the different kind of timelines over which things change, and make me think that when we look at projects, we don't look at those multiple layers. And I'm reminded, I remember he had this foundation, the Long Now. I don't know whether people know this. They were designing a clock that would last for 10,000 years. And it reminds me of some of the things you were saying earlier, that, I think our ability to think about the longer term and plan for those different kind of timescales that you're talking about, even in the one project, doesn't come out a lot. Did I see a question? Yeah. Oh, sorry, no, somebody's just waving. Is there a question? Or did anyone want to comment on the other side?
I was just going to say, we all fell in love with our green spaces in the city during COVID. Like the green space outside the Chester Beatty Museum was my back garden, really. And obviously, like what I did see outside my window was a bicycle lane appear all the way along the quays. Yeah. So things are changing, but I think, it is, I think, individual people choosing to cycle and then being accommodated by the city to cycle is obviously part of this. Public transport, there's no doubt more needs to be done, and there's more greening of the city done, but we also need more spaces between our urban fabrics as well. And obviously we need to make sure that our neighbourhoods are mixed neighbourhoods that allow people to...
Yeah.
I think...
Sorry.
I think we need a bigger shift change, and we need a different way of thinking, because at the moment we're being led by very neoliberal leaders, and until we have a society that is focusing, this is very, I suppose, philosophical rather than actual logistics, but until we have a leadership that is focused on changing the definition of success and moving away from the economy of more, we're consistently going to be left with a situation where there's going to be more focus on hoarding, on not providing for others, rather. And I know that with like groups like yourself, and that is the intrinsic part of it. But where we have a society that is so focused on success equaling making more money and all that kind of stuff, it's going to just keep the imbalances of not just the haves and have-nots, but the focus on climate has to be about degrowth a lot of the time, and we're very afraid to look that in the eye. And until we start coming to terms with the fact that we can't just keep this consistent level of growth and what GDP apparently means and all that kind of stuff, we're not going to be able to focus and face head on the impact climate change is going to have on us.
I have to agree. I don't know whether people here, I really love the book Donut Economics, where there's kind of the ecological signal ceiling and the social floor, and it points to that we live our lives according to these graphs that have these particular GDP growth, and that's been ingrained in us so much that we need to shift it. So I think that captures that. You're trying to get in?
I think climate change is a massive industry, both abroad and here. It's very difficult for the average citizen to ascertain where we're actually at in respect of our environment and our climate and its impact on our day-to-day lives, because there's a huge amount of money spent on what is ultimately like propaganda and greenwashing by multinational corporations, and then that's even starting to trickle down to smaller organizations because it's a done thing, and to not be doing it then is looked upon negatively, whereas really the focus should be on what are the real world effects of our behaviours, as opposed to just being, again, that sort of green jersey brigade. We're progressing, we're helping. We've cut plastic bags, or we've done this or that, or whatever it is, and then everybody thinks, great, we're making progress. But I think like individual education on our actual position, where we're at as a country, in respect of those areas is important, because then again, it's very difficult to hold organizations, individuals within organizations to account if we don't have a good grasp of the actual impacts of their actions.
I would say as well, though, while I agree with you, greenwashing can happen and happens often. I think there's interesting instruments like, the ESG ratings you give to companies. I don't know whether anyone here has seen this very interesting Dasgupta report that shows all of these different models that take biodiversity into your, as an organisation, how you account for it. So I think the world is finding some instruments. I mean, I think this goes to that we can kind of start pushing into, but it needs to go from doing it superficially to doing it deeply.
Don't get me wrong, it's amazing stuff, but it's just important to take it out of the hands of corporate interests and put it into the hands of the people, so as we're not being told this is what's happening, rather we're seeing this is what's happening.
Good point. Any other questions? Oh, we have a question from here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm interested in the role of the artist in the city. And so, I mean, the artist has been very intrinsic to Ireland's identity, and we've seen the role of the artist during lockdown as being hugely supportive as a kind of a therapist for the society as we processed what was going on. But this isn't new. During the last recession, the artists were really, really dependent on to keep the city alive, to keep spaces open, to keep buildings from collapsing in on themselves, to keep to provide spaces for people to go to provide social function. But then as soon as the recession ended, there was nowhere for them to go. They had to leave the city, essentially. There was, their role was done. So we're seeing this conversation happen again with the amount of empty and derelict spaces. Maybe artists can do something here. But what kind of contract are we going to have with artists in the future to make sure that they're actually looked after this time, and that this relationship is actually maintained properly?
I think we are lucky that we have a good Minister for Culture who is bringing a lot to the table in terms of what the value of artists, and the fact that she has a really good value on artists, and that we're looking at stuff like the universal basic income for artists being implemented. That there's, I think it's 200 or 2,000 artists who are going to be the test case for that. So that conversation is something that's happening at the moment, that artists need something to survive, obviously, and to be paid for their work. So I think I would be hopeful that those conversations will continue, and that the dereliction and the vacancy was such an opportunity in the last recession that there may be an opportunity for that to open up artist space. But I think fundamentally and intrinsically it has to go down to city planning, and that when you're dealing with city planning, that each project that's given the go-ahead should have a space that's for artists, that is for creative spaces, that has when you have planning, you always have there's a supermarket, there's a creche, but there's artist spaces need to be in there as well as entertainment spaces. And it again goes back to the thing that it's well, that's not essential for living, where actually it's the most essential thing. And when we had COVID, it shone a light on the roles that were actually important to keep a society moving. And it was doctors, nurses, retail staff, frontline workers, and artists. Yet they all seem to be the ones that, the minute there's money going, that they're thrown to the side for jobs that don't actually mean anything a lot of the time. I don't know how many times I'm but what does that actually mean, your job? So I think that it has to come through the line from having a Minister for Culture who has a vision for providing for artists, but also in the planning stages, and that we shake off the shame that pleasure is something that's important to our lives, and that art is important. And I think that's something that we really are at loggerheads, that we like to roll artists out, but when you look at what is needed for artists to get to that stage when they're rolled out for state functions or whatever, that the supports need to be put in place from a very basic level.
Anyone else want to comment or think?
Um, Personally, like, this is something we chat about all the time, and the idea that artists need to be provided for, I think that's kind of the wrong way to start the conversation. I think it's very important for artists to make their own mark, and within the artist community to support one another. But oftentimes, probably anyone who's involved in the arts probably knows that, what's communicated and what's the public face of the scene or the community is entirely different to the realities of what actually goes on behind the curtain. So, there's obviously a complete need for art and culture within our social fabric, but it's integral that's again, I suppose, considered like a civic duty. If you're going to be an artist or involved in the arts, you better be prepared for the realities of what that means. And as long as there's this idea or this sense of, like, say, even we were speaking the other day and we were talking about UBI, why isn't there UBI for other occupations? Why is it that artists need UBI? Obviously, they do in terms of their actual livelihoods, but I think it would be better if, as a society, an artist was in a position to be able to actually sustain themselves without the support of government, rather than needing to look for support of that nature. And I think that should come from our society and from our public supporting the arts. Obviously, it's one and the same anyway, through taxation. At the end of the day, it's kind of funneled back into the arts by government. But really, I think artists need to demand support from the public. And when there is a sense that that support is not there, for that to be communicated effectively and accurately and truthfully. So,
okay, that's I think it's very. I think it's very important to think about artists being being valued fully. And as you said,
if their work is valuable, though, they shouldn't just be valued because they're artists. It should be: is your art, is your creation, is your day-to-day investment in the city or in your community, is it valuable? And if it's valuable, then it should be supported and recognised.
Then that throws up the capitalist system, and then bring it back to the question of what is art and who gets to decide.
What is art? We'll be here all night.
Really understand.
You're saying that if you're saying that art has to be valued by what you put into the system, who gets to decide that? Then you get into a capitalist kind of approach to, like, only stuff that is worth spending money on is valuable.
No, not necessarily, because it would all come down to the personal preference of the society. It doesn't have to be a capitalistic approach where only what is considered successful is supported. And I actually think that's the position we're in at the moment. There's a couple of artists at a certain level that are considered to be successful, and they would receive probably the majority of the support within society. Whereas there's an incredible pool of talent and amazing artists who are up there at the same level, if not surpassing the level of a lot of the people who are at top of the food chain, shall we say. But they're not supported by the general public because they don't have the same persona, platform, or seal of approval from a lot of, ultimately,
comes in to support them and give them space to create and to...
Of course, but again, it shouldn't be from the UBI, it should be from society, and valuing all of the different approaches and the idea of an artist in general, especially, in our society, especially in arts and culture. It's like conformity is valued over courage. People who take risks and actually try and do something different, that's considered, well, this isn't popular, it doesn't look like what's already successful, therefore I'm not going to support it. But really, at the heart of arts and culture, it should be people trying to break boundaries and, push through that glass ceiling. And you know, if someone or a group or whoever it is doing that, that's ultimately what should be supported and fostered, as opposed to the end product.
Question, yeah, it's from here. Hi.
I suppose I think I've come to this event quite a few times. I've enjoyed it a lot, and thank you to IF, obviously an open house, because every year it's a sort of a barometer of people who are interested in the city to think about it and talk about it. And I suppose it's appropriate we're in a kind of dark room and we're slightly separated from each other, and I sense that the mood is quite dark. My question is sort of, it's for Natalie's fantastic team who show us buildings every year, and it's for the panel. Do you think Natalie and her team are going to run out of great places for us to look at sometime soon? Are we getting better buildings? Are we getting any good buildings this year? What's the sense in the panel of, you know, are there great things being built?
By the way, I do agree that it is a barometer, Alan, of how people are feeling. It's very interesting you said that, but back to Alan's question, anyone want to, or if Natalie or any of her team want to answer as well?
We're definitely going to have great buildings. Like, Dublin has such a history of amazing moments in time. Like, each of the, whether you go to the Customs House or Basoras or, you know, a housing building built today, they each are about a moment in time of, you know, it's like a freeze frame of what was happening there, you know. So I think, you know, there's definitely not enough money going to, you know, cultural buildings like they are to, you know, they are absolute essentials. They're not nice to haves, you know, libraries, you know, galleries, museums, like anything in the sort of wider arts sphere, I think is like, we need to be doing more of that, way more of that, you know, and we don't have a great modern history of it. There's been a lot of great projects that have been done recently. We just need a lot more of them. And but yeah, I have total hope for this city. I think there's so much talent here in terms of the architects. Like, if you give them like the, you know, the simplest brief, the least amount of money, they'll still create something amazing. Like, we absolutely punch above our weight in terms of the talent that's here. So I've total hope. You know, even going around people's house extensions, like what they can do with such a small thing is incredible. So imagine what they could do with an amazing public building, you know, so.
But are we getting the opportunity for public buildings? You just have to look at Grafton Architects, who just getting the RIBA award, and the fact that like buildings like that aren't even in the conversation, and the projects that they are involved in are not getting greenlit or pushed forward, and that everything seems to be reactive or private market, which seems to be about getting the most return on the builds rather than creating something stunning. And as a non-architect, I suppose, walking through the city, when you look at all the beautiful Georgian buildings, the big central banks, the big Trinity colleges, it doesn't feel like there's an output of that level or that vision, and that everything seems to be glass offices and I suppose a very corporate scape. And I wonder if there is going to be something that is more socially led, like the space for conversations that the Grafton Architects just did.
And I suppose I think it depends on what you think is beautiful to look at. I mean, I actually love this space and some of the walls outside. And I was thinking, I went on some great tours of bad buildings, which I think that's a great thing about open house. You get to see what things that work and things that don't work. But I do agree that you do wonder, is there kind of, I think there's great talent, there's things to look at. You do wonder, are there things missing from the picture in terms of maybe ambition? What do you think? Do you think we will run out, or do you think there's...
Well, I can very clearly say that I'm fundamentally looking out our windows, and we are getting a whole slew of really poor buildings. They're not going anywhere. They've been there for 50 or 70 years. I am outraged at what's going on here.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a difference in general. They take a walk out of the street and they look at what's on the side of what's been built. Is there nothing at all? And I think there's such a point where we've got the energy system,
Yeah. No, it's okay. I don't know whether people heard that because I to make sure you had the microphone again, but basically there was an expression of great worry that we wouldn't have good buildings to look at. And so, sorry, just saying it in one short sentence, expressed much more eloquently than I did there. Are there any other, Natalie, do you want to?
Hi. Yeah, just to respond to Alan's question. Yeah, I will say that putting together the programme for Open House is often quite difficult. And it goes back to the comment from Andrew about the quality of buildings that are out there in the city. It's quite frustrating sometimes because our role is to communicate quality architecture to the general public, to make them fall in love with their city again, to do all of these things, which is really important, to encourage them and empower them to be part of their city. And I'm often looking at the programme going, oh my God, this is going to be hard to sell to them. You know what I mean? And apart from the great work that's done by the teams in local authorities, etc., and stuff like that, it's sometimes really, really difficult to find a new story and a new angle. We always, if you look through our programme, we always tend to go back to history, and we start to talk about the past and how the past can help the future. Linda, you were here 2 years ago at the debate, and the same discussion is happening tonight, right? It is so frustrating. And at the same time, I see an incredible amount of talented architects out there who don't get to build any part of this city and are unbelievably talented, and they would add so much to the city in terms of the diversity. So you don't just see Georgian architecture and glass and steel and all of that. You see a whole variety of great design that fits with the context. Like, and that's to your point, Andrea, you're dead right. And I've just come from a tour of the ESB building on Fitzwilliam Square, which is designed by Grafton and OMP. And that's just a fantastic piece of architecture that just fits so wonderfully into that site. It's just the most amazing thing I've seen, and I'm there going, oh my God, I can't wait for this to be an open house next year. I cannot wait to tell the public about this. I just can't wait. And I haven't had that feeling for a few years. You know, and this is, and actually I saw when they were announced, so they got the Sterling Prize, which is fantastic and wonderful. And I think Emmett Scanlon tweeted, it's really interesting, all of our state institutions are congratulating Grafton architects who actually can't, under our procurement laws, get a job in Dublin. So it's not true, but like, no, the City Library, sorry, but like, but he was just, you know, it's the procurement situation as well.
I was just going to say that, and I'm sure if we had a debate about public procurement, there'd be crowds here. But I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the public procurement in the country, and you can't compete as a small business and procure jobs as individuals, as kind of offering something alternative. And it's certainly something that we see on our side as an institution. And you know, going back to your questions about do people understand how things work, there's something that's hugely technical that fundamentally, in my opinion, needs to be changed, but you'd bore someone to death explaining to them how it works. So I think it's a complicated challenge for us. Yeah.
So when I was working in Copenhagen, you know, there was a lot of people in the office, same age as me, who left and set up their own offices, and they're all super talented, really brilliant architects. Almost every single one of those architects has built 3 or 4 major public buildings by now. You know, we don't have one in Dublin, you know, because the opportunities aren't there. You know? So, to my point, I think we just need to be doing more and more and more. We have to be careful because, like, building buildings is like terrible for the environment, so we have to be really careful what we build. But I think we definitely need to be building more public buildings here, and we need to carefully think about what they are. But I don't think we've supported that enough as a nation, So yeah.
I kept thinking that there's some kind of a ventilation system gone on, but I think this is rain on the roof, is it, that we're hearing? But we have questions? I have a question from here, and I think we'll probably wrap time then. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. The title of the thing, "Living for the City," sort of implies that it's up to the citizens, whatever. And it sounded like, it just reminded me of the city's motto, which is "the obedience of the citizen is the happiness of the city." Not many people sort of really think about that ever, but it's written on all the lampposts. And one thing that was sort of really striking coming out of COVID and after the lockdowns and during it was the sense people had of suddenly it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, as far back as I can remember, there's always been activists about different issues about buildings in the cities, whether it's Wood Quay, Georgian buildings. There's always been campaigning, but it's all been kind of minority campaigners who are a little bit peripheral to the mainstream of everyday life of people. I don't think a lot of people were thinking about the city. And the city always struck me as a city that's alienated from itself. It was an invader city, and there were a lot of beautiful historical buildings, but those are the buildings of the invader. They were really, in a way, there was this history of not having spaces for the people in the city. I'm just wondering, is there a space in the city that you think really exemplifies what the city should be, whether it's a building or a public space? I mean, what's the space in the city that you think says this is what the city could be like?
I think this is a good final question for people. Do you?
I think the contents of this conversation can be all summarized into one project that we were lucky enough to be involved in recently, and it's called MEND, and it's located at 348 Harold's Cross Road. It's a former Kenilworth Motors, and it's been transformed from a building that was left vacant and idle for 4 years. It's being developed into 54 apartments, and in the interim, this group of artists have taken the space over and transformed it. It's absolutely incredible. But what's happening there in terms of grassroots community engagement with the development of local community, the creation of amenities, the platform for artists, and then all of that combined creates conversation around how the city should be shaped. So, in our opinion, that's probably like the most pressing, relevant and live example of these different sort of facets and cross-sections of society engaging together and creating something that, at least in our opinion, is one of the most impressive things to come out of the city in the last number of years.
It's a good comment on that. Anyone else want to give an answer to that?
I'm always going to say South William Street.
South William Street. Does anyone have anything?
I was going to agree with it. I know Andrea would get there first and was always told it. But it is an amazing street because it's so vibrant. We were talking about it before this, and it's just over time it's such an incredible. It's a brilliant question. Like, what space in your city represents the city? But even in the last 3 years, it's happened to South William Street being pedestrianised pretty much. But it's amazing, seeing how it can change, and I love the buzz of the place and the vibrancy, and I think it's a fantastic space in the city.
I think that the thing about why it's vibrant is that it's respectful of all the inhabitants, and it's not a monoculture of inhabitants. You don't know who's up above in all the little studios and nooks and crannies of the street. Whilst you have a commercial space, but you also have a very street focused on pleasure, and also if we could just get more people living there as well.
And do you want to throw any space in, Bob?
What I would say is everywhere where we've seen people sitting outdoors and enjoying the space of the city, we thought we were an indoor city until COVID came along. So, places like Parliament Street, South William Street, all these new spaces, where people are just enjoying themselves and enjoying the city.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think there isn't. I don't think that. I think we'll wrap it there. And first of all, I just want to thank very much the panel for their time and very interesting answers. And a really special thanks to Natalie and her team. I hadn't realised when this title came up that it actually was a song by Stevie Wonder. And I looked at the song earlier. Yeah, I'm hopeless at anything to do with music, but I looked at the song earlier, and I think I was wondering whether I would call out this verse of it, because actually, Alan, I think it captures how dark everyone's mood is in. And one of the things you kind of feel is that maybe you shouldn't end a panel discussion on a very dark note, but it says, "I hope you hear inside my voice of sorrow, and that it motivates you to make a better tomorrow. This place is cruel. Nowhere could be much colder. If we don't change, the world will soon be over. Living just enough, stop giving just enough for the city." And I think even though those are kind of very sorrowful words, and it's not, I suppose, within my nature to, I'm a perpetual optimist, I have to say. I do feel, and I think it goes back actually to what Natalie was saying earlier, the themes that we're discussing here tonight are exactly the themes we discussed in a lot of the big debate before, whether people understand how you can negotiate it, who has agency, what artists are, whether they're taken seriously or given the respect they're due. I think we've discussed those a lot, and I think it's beholden on us all to go out and act and make that change. So thank you very, very much. To everybody, and thank you to the audience, and thank you to the people who've been listening and the live streaming, and I hope you can hear with the rain, and yes, let's go out there and do more, I suppose, is all we can say at the end of this. So thank you. Thank you guys.